Welcome back, humble viewers, to your favourite bite-sized, politically astute video column, Conservative Libertarian. In the news this week, and every other week for the past 2 years, is the issue of, how do I put this delicately, large groups of young African men, particularly of South Sudanese descent, tearing up the physical, social and cultural fabric of multicultural Melbourne. This one's a doozy. How do you define a crime wave that doesn't quite fit the definition of gang violence? How do you report a 28% increase in unique violent offenders by those of a certain young African nation, leaving them 44 times more likely to commit crimes and 6 times more likely to be arrested than the general population, without sounding like you're recruiting for the United Patriots Front or sympathising with the alt-right? And more importantly, how do you solve an issue that's been brewing for so many years, that some of these so-called Sudanese kids involved are actually first-generation Aussies? Now, for the sake of expediency and lacking any other remotely accurate or appropriately defining terms, I'm going to refer to this phenomenon as African youth violence. Yeah, go tweet about it, mate, because this is an issue that's touched me very personally among hundreds of other Melburnians and Victorians who feel like they're losing control of the streets in the world's most livable city. A state election is due at the end of the year, and with politicians all the way up to the Prime Minister weighing in on the issue recently, you could bet your trashed Airbnb house on the fact that the major parties are both going to try and make hay. But all the grandstanding, pork-barrelling, virtue signalling and baseless empty promises in the world aren't going to solve this problem. In fact, a lot of this game playing will only further entrench current divisions in our society, and Melbourne just can't afford to leave this one on the back burner any longer. Other capital cities have similarly sized African descent populations, albeit a significantly lower proportion of refugee families from Sudan, but this problem with unprovoked violence is uniquely Victorian. And when even the social justice freaks at Victoria Police Command admit this is the case, you can take it to the bank as truth. Up until now, every time someone from head office or the police media unit has publicly discussed the issue, it's been to quibble over the fact that because the force isn't aware of any official hierarchy to these groups, you can't technically call it gang violence. Right, have a good time explaining that one to those on the receiving end of a beating who are now being advised to use the politically correct term, networked offending. Run, Tom, it's a bunch of African networked offenders with wireless melee weapons. It's just as well our Chief Commissioner's on the case, helping to sort this out. Having thrown Victoria Police behind the Yes campaign for gay marriage, which I fully support by the way, before taking 6 weeks off for stress late last year, he rung in the new year by calling the idea that Melbourne has a safety issue complete and utter garbage. Such garbage, in fact, that he set up a new task force in coalition with the African community leaders to blame victims of violent crime for their horrendous bigotry. Hierarchy of victimhood be damned, hey? Now, unlike some other commentators or Peter Dutton, I've been through the police process and its aftermath, which, as you might expect, led to no charges being laid, as well as the victim blaming on social media by an army of leftist keyboard warriors following a news story about the incident on Channel 9. And while the mainstream media's coverage of the issue has been simplistic at best, there are many good journalists and reporters out there who feel hamstrung in how to address the topic, lest they be forced into diversity training or cost their channel advertising dollars by the growing army of PC multinational megacorporations. Let me tell you my story. I was violently assaulted twice in the space of about 7 minutes. Now, I'll cop the victim blaming for the second one. I made the mistake of actually asking for help after being beaten bloody, concussed on the concrete and robbed by 8 big dudes, obviously of African descent. But the second group of 5 networked offenders I begged to call an ambulance had other ideas. Fine, whatever. But while the first assault was underway, one of the friends I was in town with ran onto Flemington Road and flagged down a highway patrol car, informing the police officer of an assault in progress and asking for help. Their response? To label our presence in the area stupid and question why we were there in the first place. In the end, they had to seek out some real cops further down the road while the second assault was underway, And from there it took about 30 seconds to have a convoy of 6 squad cars, a brawler van and an ambulance on the scene, pursuing the perpetrators and treating my wounds. With the first group of 8 networked offenders making off with my keys, phone and wallet, they proceeded to use my American Express card to purchase prepaid gift cards from a local vendor, trading as Eastern Food and Gifts, who conveniently don't have CCTV cameras and didn't assist the investigation, presumably because they appreciate the business at 1 AM on a Tuesday morning. I'm loath to associate low-income housing or housing commission areas with violent crime or unsavoury people, and always have been. Some of the best people I know are of the least economic means. In the same way, I perhaps naively refuse to acknowledge so-called no-go areas of Melbourne, primarily black areas in my city where I just shouldn't be as a white male, and I'm not talking about Indigenous Australians here. But there are still some lessons we can take from this ordeal that don't end in a Milo Yiannopoulos-style distaste for everything imported. Because Australia at its very core is a land of imports. From the earliest Aboriginal settlers between 50 and 65,000 years ago, through the arrival of the First Fleet to a massively multicultural present, everything Australia has ever cherished effectively has its roots someplace else on Earth. It's why we need to stay so vigilant on African youth violence, lest it undermine the generosity of spirit we're known for all over the world, or collapse the migration programs that ultimately make us who we are. Unfortunately, that undermining has already started, and while Peter Dutton stokes the flames in an obvious way, Daniel Andrews and comrades flat out deny anything's wrong. They would rather ridicule people like me who actually know better, but don't have the benefit of a 24/7 police escort through the northern and western suburbs. I'd really rather not carry my gun when travelling through North Melbourne, but if the police are too scared to patrol for fear of being labelled racist, or having some Guardian reporter turn their job into a Twitter storm about police brutality, or the courts continue to give 2-month good behaviour bonds and 30 hours of community service for a third offence of borderline murder, because the offenders had it hard in the old country, or the Premier of the state refuses to even acknowledge the issues Melbourne's cultural ghettos have created, there's getting to be little other choice. Ever the optimist though, I believe there are lessons that we can learn right now that will brighten our future. The first is that our state's approach to policing has become pathetically driver-centric. Whether it's point-to-point speed cameras on the world's safest freeways or the unwillingness of highway patrol cops to momentarily shift their focus to dealing with real criminals, the Victorian government needs to get off the backs of commuters and force that focus onto violent crime permanently. This is where our law enforcement resources are being shamefully wasted. Remember, if you or your friends ever find yourself in real trouble, be sure to find a real police officer to help. The ones that actually protect and serve, not the ones who just love driving V8s they don't have to fuel and bullying people for doing walking speed in a slower than walking speed zone. The vast majority of our uniformed officers are in it for the right reasons, and they desperately need our respect and support, because they're the ones who will put your safety as a member of the community before even their own. Second lesson, we're never going to be able to deal with African youth violence while our political and police leadership struggle to call a spade whenever there's a racial, ethnic or cultural dimension to the crime. This is the part of the debate where anyone wanting to discuss the issue in easily comprehensible language gets called an alt-right sympathiser or a racist bigot. I don't actually give a shit what you call it. Sudanese gang violence, African youth violence, network defending, it's all irrelevant to how we solve the problem. The toxicity that is identity politics has clearly taken root right here in Melbourne, and on issues like this, the Australian left is roughly where the American left was 5 to 10 years ago. Eventually, someone at the top of the pile is going to have to take the risk of offending people so the progress, that ethereal concept usually associated with the political left, can actually be made here. Because until they do, we're stuck with these horrendous acts of physical violence that clearly have their roots in a toxic culture that wants nothing to do with multicultural Melbourne, for as long as Daniel Andrews remains Premier of Victoria. He's spent so much of his state and national airtime as leader establishing unparalleled PC credentials, chiming in on issues the state government has no influence over whatsoever. If there's a leader in the Labor Party that's going to tackle this issue head on, Dan will probably do his darndest to make sure they never get anywhere near a position of influence. Finally, and possibly most importantly, the conservative libertarian in you, yes, there is one in us all, knows that no matter who is in power this time next year, we cannot buy our way out of African youth violence that's 10 or 20 years in the making. The Labor Party have run this state for 16 of the past 20 years, and I think that's enough to sheet a majority of the blame for these long-term problems right home to the ALP. We opened our hearts and our home to refugees escaping civil war in newly formed South Sudan and disintegrating Somalia so they could escape the violence, not bring it here. With that, we offered benefits, public housing, education opportunities, some of the best public healthcare in the world, and in the case of certain ethnic groups, even tailored assistance packages worth millions of dollars to assist with social integration and job training. We've been more than fair. Now it's time to be firm. All of us who've been directly affected by this, and the vast majority who haven't, just want our city to be safe again, safe for everyone, immigrants, locals and tourists. So stop blaming the rest of society for the problems of a tiny minority and put these crooks in jail. While you're at it, get the judges to throw away the key instead of letting them off for being culturally oppressed, which is a fundamentally racist way of dispensing justice. No arm of our government is above criticism on these issues, so the elected judges need to be taken to task every bit as much as our elected officials. Use your vote wisely this November, Victoria, and always direct your preferences manually. Despite the inevitability of a victory for Labor or the Liberals, the flow of preferences will have more of an impact than you might think. As well, the election of MLCs that sit outside the major parties will give them significant influence over policy as it passes through the upper house. And data on the way we vote will actually help the major parties more accurately tailor their product in future years, because believe it or not, they do actually want your vote. So when it finally dawns on them that the voters are so angry, so fed up with the way major party inaction is ruining the state and the city, that they've started directing their preferences elsewhere, someone at a cushy CBD head office is going to sit up and take notice. That's it for now, dear tubers. Thank you for your extended attention these past weeks and months. We definitely breached our 160 character limit this episode, but I do hope it was illuminating enough to be worth your time. Assuming I'm not deplatformed or doxxed for discussing a complex cultural issue, I'll be back to cover the Victorian state election for season 2. Remember to subscribe to the channel, and if you have an issue with anything I've said, and especially if you just disagree, leave a comment. Because the best way out of the hole we've dug ourselves is to have open, honest, and yes, occasionally uncomfortable discussions with those on the other side of whatever political aisle we find ourselves in. But for now, you have a good day, okay?